Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our today's program at the Weisman Art Museum, Extensive Alterations. But before we begin, as always, we will acknowledge that the Weisman Art Museum stands on the traditional and contemporary land of the Dakota people. We aspire to honor and respect the indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, by incorporating indigenous knowledge in our work and establishing meaningful reciprocal relationships with the carriers of indigenous knowledge and with communities. We also acknowledge that the land acknowledgement is merely the first step in a long and complex process of reconciling with the colonial past and present of our institution. I would like to state our commitment to this process. I am Boris Zuckerman. I am the Cindy and J. Ehlenfeld Curator for Creative Collaboration at the Weisman. I curate the program of the Target Studio for Creative Collaboration, where we develop artist-led projects that cross disciplines, institutions, sectors, communities, cultures, and geographies. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Weisman Art Museum for supporting the program for creative collaboration and for making this event happen. When first Chris approached me with this incredible story of a patient who was also an artist and just couldn't turn the artistic sensibilities off, I was quite amazed. It's just an incredible story that I feel should be shared and should be told about how collaborations develop in very, very unexpected ways, even if it's a collaboration between the patient and a doctor. So what we will hear today is the story kind of told by the actual participants of the story, by the artists and by the doctors. This conversation is also accompanied by a pop-up installation by Chris that is at the Weisman Art Museum in the Riverview Gallery, and it runs until Sunday. It includes the artworks and also an artist book with bigger collection of artworks that were inspired by Chris's experience. A little bit of a housekeeping. We have a live ASL interpretation. Thank you so much to our interpreters tonight, Susan and Jasmine. We also have a live transcription going on, but you will need to turn it on the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen. We have two ways of communication today between us. If you want to ask a question, you can address your question through the Q&A feature, also at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to post a comment or a response to a conversation, please use the chat feature. We will be reading both of these means of communication, but we might miss some details of what's going on in the chat. So if you want us to respond to things, please post it in the Q&A. And with that, John Halberg will be moderating today's conversation. John, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Boris. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. I'm a family physician. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Minnesota Medical School. But I am here this evening in my capacity as the creative director for the Center for the Art of Medicine. And our work at the medical school is doing just this. It's bringing artists and medicine together in unique and creative ways. What I'm going to do is introduce my three physician colleagues who are members of the panel, and then I will introduce our main, the main focus of our evening together, and that's our artist patient. So without any further ado, let me introduce Dr. Janine Pingle next. Dr. Pingle is here at the Mill City Clinic with me. She's in one of the exam rooms. I'm in our conference room. We're across the street from the Guthrie Theater. We're an art and light-filled space, and Dr. Pingle is a board-certified internist and pediatrician, And she's one of the most brilliant primary care people that I know. I think there's a reason why she's been invited to this conversation this evening, as it will become very clear when Chris has a chance to say a few things. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pingle, who's been with me here at the Mill City Clinic since 2009. The next person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Greg Beilman, who is a surgeon and ICU specialist. And I think that it's worth mentioning two other things, and that is that Greg took an incredibly important role during the COVID pandemic, and his work was instrumental in the great work that I think the University of Minnesota did during this unprecedented time. Greg is also a member of the Army Reserves, and he has had multiple deployments overseas, and is just an incredible human being and surgeon and administrator, and he wears many hats, and I'm just scratching the surface with that introduction. And then the next person I want to introduce is Dr. Melena Bellin, who is a physician scientist. She's a pediatric endocrinologist by training. She also holds an appointment in the Department of Surgery, and she and Greg together, I'm not going to spill the beans just yet, but they've really become, pioneers in a particular kind of transplantation work. They'll become clear as our conversation unfolds. So thank you for joining us. And then last but not least, really the reason that we've all gathered here this evening is because of Christopher Houltberg. Chris is an associate professor of art and design at Augsburg University. And his story is truly remarkable. And I was saying this beforehand when we were kind of prepping our conversation a little bit, that he has really lived a hero's journey. I really think of the work of Joseph Campbell and kind of the arc of this story. This story could just be a really interesting medical conference presentation. We often say in medicine, we have an M&M conference, a morbidity and mortality conference, and it can have that flavor of somebody who suffered, and we're sort of trying to teach each other about that. But the reason we're here, the reason that the Weisman Art Museum is supporting this, is because Chris is an artist. And the way that he has viewed his journey, the way that he's viewed his illness and his recovery, and his attention to detail, is something that none of us on this evening have ever experienced before, which is really remarkable. So Chris, welcome, and thank you for sharing your story with us and with all of the folks that are joining this. Please, I think that, I keep using the word journey. You have been on one heck of a journey, and please start, where you'd like to start with this. And I know you've got a couple, you might want to share with us a little bit of a visual interpretation of your journey. And let's just start with that.
Sure. Let me pull this up real quick. Were you able to see this slides?
We were just for a second there, and then it came back to the main screen here.
Yeah, so, all right. Thanks for all being here. I appreciate the doctors being here, especially after the last couple of years. I know that you've carried so much burden on your shoulders, so I appreciate you participating in this. I started my experience with chronic pancreatitis, I believe, started back when I was about 17 years old, and I had my first bout with pain. Pain became this kind of consistent element in my life experience, and it'd sort of pop up and stick around for a little bit and then kind of hide and go away. But it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I actually got diagnosed with chronic pancreatitis. And in that process, of experiencing pain, it became this like repetitive component to my life, where I sort of would get used to going into the doctor, and they kind of knew what was going on, but I was, at the time in college, so I was moving around a lot and didn't have a consistent doctor. But then what had happened in 2012, 2013, was essentially I woke up one day and the pain didn't go away. And so for me, what happened from there was about 5 years of navigating the medical care system. And as you can see from the slide here, all of the map that I made here for all the different specialists that I had to see and the way that I had to actually make my way through the medical system. And that part of it is really where the show came from. As an artist, I typically start with collecting things. That's my sort of process. I collect data and I sort of reinterpret that. In the past, I've used and looked at more consumer systems. And so in this case, as I was navigating this in this lived experience, I had to begin collecting data and learning and looking at medical records and carrying those medical records with me. And so when I started this, there was no intention of this being an art project by any means. It was just sort of me doing what I do, and that's trying to collect as much information as possible. And a lot of that changed when I met Dr. Pingle in 2000. I really met her in 2010 briefly. We had a brief stint together where she got me through a kind of a rough 3 or 4 month stint, and then came back in 2014. And that's where sort of my experience drastically changed once I got to Dr. Pingle.
And what was it about that like what changed? I mean, was Dr. Pingle, you know, I mean, I kind of alluded to this earlier. I mean, Janine is a superb internist and pediatrician. I think she's dogged in her approach, but what was different, Chris?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, a portion of this is like I was really tired and I was actually getting sicker and sicker. So for me, it was about finding someone who could not only hear me and maybe listen to what I was trying to say, but also help me figure out how to navigate the system. I think that was what was drastically different. I joke with Dr. Pingle before that she was the first person that really stopped and said, "Hey, let me hear you. What are you saying?" And she sort of would repeat it back to me. And I think from that point, we were able to kind of problem solve. I don't know, we've talked about this before, Dr. Pingle, but more about you and I sort of coming alongside each other and sort of taking ownership of it.
Yeah, Janine, why don't you jump in? I'm curious, was it something about Chris's story that you know captured you, or that you realized that something was missing? I would love to know more about that.
Yeah. Well, there were two things, and the first was kind of that initial visit that we had, I think in 2010, that we got through it, and I hadn't seen Chris for a really long time, and then suddenly 2 or 3 years later, he's back in my clinic, and I'm thinking, this does not look like the guy I remember. He looks sick to me. And you know, the only thing I can remember thinking was, okay, let somebody just tell their story. It's got to be in this story. And he had this stack of, do you remember this, Chris? You brought in this huge stack of pieces of paper for me to go through, like the medical records and everything. It was quite daunting. And so my job at that point was like, be a listener, try to dialogue, try to troubleshoot. I had my homework there for me. And I think it was just like that relationship that we developed really had to be a give and take, because I realized that there was a lot going on and I had to begin somewhere. So I just had to keep asking. And I believe we had quite a few visits together. In short periods of time to try to figure out which path we were going to go to next. So,
and I should just jump in, Chris. The reason that there was a gap of 4 years is it was not because of bad care or Dr. Pingle not following through. It was an insurance issue, right? I mean, right. Just let folks know that there's this gap, which is kind of part and parcel to healthcare these days. That you can be at a clinic, suddenly we're not in we're not covered by that insurance anymore, and we're sort of stuck unless we're paying out of pocket. So there was that piece, and then Chris. So I mean, you came back. You're seeing Dr. Pingle. She's clearly listening, deeply listening, and yet it sounds like it was still a process. It wasn't easy. I mean, it wasn't like there was an aha moment right away. Was that frustrating for you?
For sure. I mean, I think that anyone who has lived with a chronic illness or been with someone that they love with a chronic illness knows the feeling of being in the waiting rooms. And I can recall really specifically the change in the type of waiting rooms I was in. So at first it is like general practice, family practice, and there's, you know, kids running around and there's TVs on. And then gradually they got a little bit more serious. And then there's people that have their family members with them in those appointments. And all of a sudden people feel sick. It was a drastic change in the way that that experience started to unfold. And, you know, as time goes on, like you're trying to work out this rationale for what's happening. And so I'm trying to help problem solve and also feeling quite ill. And so it required so much energy. I think that's one of the things that is really important to me in the process of sort of reflecting. Now I can look back and say, yeah, I was really exhausted physically and mentally and emotionally, because all of those elements play into the components of navigating this.
Yeah, it could be so exhausting being your own advocate while you're ill.
Yeah.
Chris, did you ever wonder? I mean, because no one's finding, there's no smoking gun, right? There's no, for ages and ages, there's no like aha moment. Did you start to doubt what was going on? Did you ever question yourself, like, God, is this just functional, or there has to be something going on? I mean, you must have had all kinds of thoughts going through your head at this point. I mean,
yeah, well, for sure. And I mean, you know, I'm fortunate enough that I have an incredible support system. So for me, that's like the consistent that helps you sort of get you through. And then learning some new tools. I think learning to assess pain is not something that comes easily. Like learning to listen to your body. I had the great privilege of taking a class called mindfulness-based stress reduction at the University of Minnesota. It was fantastic. And I learned a lot about listening to pain and understanding pain and understanding it in my own body, which is a learning process. So yes, most definitely I questioned it and also learned to listen a little bit better.
So Janine, what was the, you know, I mean, I kind of know a little bit of the backstory here, but what the heck? I mean, how did you finally kind of figure out, at least have some sense of what was going on?
You know, in medicine, they always tell us there's, you know, common presentations of common illnesses, uncommon presentations of common illnesses, uncommon with uncommon illnesses, et cetera. And I just knew that this was something that this was going to be a challenge. And I just knew that I couldn't stop listening to what Chris said. It just was so compelling. And I remember, Chris, when I met you, I think you were just finished grad school or something. You had like your wife was having a baby. I think your wife came in to have that visit with us, with us at that point, you know, and was really, really worried. And you know, we kept going down paths of really common things and uncommon things. And I just said to myself, I've got to get more eyes on you. Like when one pair of eyes is not enough, get your friends, get your colleagues, get thoughts going, because I had a sense that I knew what direction we needed to put you in. And even though the workup had been done prior and a very good workup for you, it wasn't giving us the answers. But I felt very confident that, you know, I just needed to reach out for more help. And that's how, I think that's how we ended up just putting you in through the specialty clinics. And from there, things kind of began to unfold. It wasn't as fast as I think we anticipated it would. It took still longer, but I think we just started scratching the surface, and it was kind of gratifying to sort of see things opening up and seeing that whole process take place. So it was amazing watching you. Chris, you were amazing. I've never seen anybody you know, like take charge of like, I'm going to deal with this pain, even though I don't know what it is. There wasn't a day that I didn't learn something from you. And you always like were so inspiring to me. And I thought, I got to go to the end. I got to help this guy. I would help you no matter what, but you made it easy. So it was really it was kind of a scary journey, because I didn't want anything, you know, to go unturned. I didn't know which way it was going to go. We kind of thought we always thought we had already unturned all these stones, but we just were in a really complex situation. And I'm glad you stuck with us and were patient. And I think that if there's one thing that I learned with this entire situation, it was just be patient and just keep listening. So
So Chris, do you think that, I want to ask you one question, and then we're gonna make the journey over to at least my other side of the screen here with our two other colleagues here. Chris, do you think that as an artist, because you have this like attention to detail and because you're like a data gatherer, do you think that was part of your success? Like that was part of your, like, because you had that doggedness, that attention to detail, you were looking for things. Did that help you as a patient?
I was raised in a house of runners, so maybe long distance running helped a little bit, like the perseverance notion. No, I don't know. I think when you, I don't know, for me, I had a lot of reasons to fight. I had a lot of good in my life. And so fighting for that was worth it to me. It was really out of the blue that I got sick. It just my life just sort of turned upside down, even though I had these episodes throughout, it was 15 years prior, but this was a turning point that was, I knew there was not much option but to fight.
So in this doggedness between the two of you, Dr. Pingle and Chris, what specialty clinic finally kind of found the thing that started to make sense? Tell us about that and how we kind of ended up seeing our two other colleagues here.
Well, I'd gone to the GI clinic at the U of M and that specialty clinic, and they had an intake process, and Dr. Beilman probably would be able to speak to it, and Dr. Beilman would be able to speak to it much better than I would. But essentially, in that intake process, they began to question around my pancreas and started asking a little bit more detailed questions around that, because as I've come to learn, the pancreas is a bit of a hidden organ, so it doesn't always like to show you its cards, right? So it was a bit hidden from everything that was going on. And so they kind of had that breadcrumb trails. And then at the same time, I was getting sicker and having rapid weight loss. And I think around that time was when I got my first feeding tube. So I'd gotten my NJ tube, which goes through your nose and down your throat, and then all the way down to the jejunum. And I think that's around that time is when I met Louise, actually, and then met Dr. Beilman.
So Greg, yeah, like this is a perfect segue, a perfect introduction to you. So you see this young man with fire in his belly, trying to get well, isn't looking not healthy, losing weight, probably coming into your office for an appointment with a feeding tube in his nose. What goes through your mind in a case like that? And then is this a fairly, when people end up in your office in a case like this, I'm guessing they've been in similar long, puzzling, frustrating journeys. What's it like when you're making that first, introduction to a patient like Chris?
So first, I think that patients are relieved to find a group of healthcare providers, and I say a group because it really is a team, that is willing to try to understand the pathophysiology of what's going on with those particular patients. And I am lucky to be part of a great team of doctors and nurses and other care providers who are all focused on this disease as one of those unusual diseases with unusual presentations, as Janine put it, that makes people miserable. And many people like Chris have lived through the experience of being told you're an alcoholic or you're a drug seeker. And so many people are just relieved to land in Melena's office or my office or Marty Freeman's office, and not be told that, to be listened to seriously, to have a thoughtful history and evaluation that takes place in our situation. And again, we're lucky to work in a location where we get to focus on the unusual presentation of unusual disease and get good at it. Certainly people in primary care or a general surgeon who is taking out gallbladders, for instance, in her or his practice, doesn't have that luxury of being able to focus on people literally from all over the country who are looking for help with this kind of problem.
I always think of a pyramid, and Janine and I are down here, we're seeing everything. You kind of hope that people get channeled up here, and that's where you sit, Greg, I think, in this capacity. And Melena, I think it'd be really important at this point for us, as there's plenty of lay folks, listening to this conversation. Why in the world is a pediatric endocrinologist on this call with someone who's clearly not in the pediatric population? And I think if you could also tell us a little bit about the pancreas, this kind of funny organ, and what your work has been in this area.
Yeah, thanks, John and Chris. So I am a pediatrician by training, and my personal journey to get here actually has to do with the research work I do in the pancreas. Even though clinically I was trained as a pediatrician, the research work that I've been fortunate enough to do with patients in the pancreas realm has brought me to working both with kids and adults who have this very unusual condition of chronic pancreatitis, uncommon condition of chronic pancreatitis, where it is so severe that we're actually thinking about doing this major surgery that Chris had done, where we actually take the pancreas out. So I come into play pretty late in Chris's journey, and that's usually the case with other patients that I see too, because the condition that Chris was struggling with, pancreatitis that was causing pain, is really a gastrointestinal disease. So the pancreas itself has these two components to it, and they develop together. There's the part that does digestion. So about 98% of the pancreas makes digestive enzymes that gets kind of squirted into our intestine and helps digest food. And then the other 2% of the pancreas, though, that's kind of weaved within that digestive pancreas, is what we call the islets. And the islets are these spherical clusters of cells that make several hormones, but most notably make insulin, the hormone that helps us control blood sugars. And people who don't make insulin will get diabetes. So insulin is essentially the hormone that keeps all of us from having diabetes. So the problem that Chris had is really with the digestive part. But here he comes to me late in the journey because he has this severe pancreatitis, and it's so significant, and we have so few medical treatment options that one of the only things we can offer to actually relieve those years of pain is to actually take that pancreas out. And when we take the pancreas out, you're taking out that digestive part that's causing pain, but you're also unfortunately taking out the islet part, the part that actually is healthy and you need to help prevent diabetes. And so there's a very specialized procedure that we do here that actually is not done in many institutions around the country, where we can take the pancreas to a special lab that processes the pancreas and takes out specifically that islet tissue. And we do what we call a transplant, but it's not really a transplant in the sense people would think of a conventional transplant. We give the patient, like Chris, back their own islets to try to, prevent that diabetes that would occur from taking out the pancreas. And this, what we have up here is Chris's picture actually of his islet tissue. And so this is under a microscope, right? So these are really tiny clusters of cells that you can't see visually if you're looking at them, at least not with any definition. But these areas here that are stained in red are these clusters of several hundred to a couple thousand cells together that make the insulin. And obviously Chris doesn't have a pancreas after it's taken out. So we're putting these back in a different part of the body. And the way we're doing that actually is by putting them into the liver. It turns out it's pretty easy to get them into the liver because you have a big vein called the portal vein that brings blood flow into the liver. And if you actually just let the islet tissue go into that blood flow, it's going to flow right with the blood into the liver and get stuck in those smaller vessels in the liver. And after a while, it's actually a little conversation that happens between these islets and the liver tissue, and they make new blood vessels and form a new home. And as Chris can probably speak to, everyone's on insulin initially, but some people are fortunate enough to be able to come off insulin once those cells actually have a chance to make their new home in the liver.
So backing up for a second, so if you have this organ and its main purpose is to digest food, and if there's pancreatic cancer, there's a stone that's blocking the ability of those digestive enzymes to get out. You have chronic pancreatitis. Is it fair to say that those enzymes are kind of digesting the pancreas itself, and
Yeah.
that's really what's causing the pain?
That's exactly what happens is, yep, those enzymes, for various reasons. It can be a genetic reason, a genetic problem, some of which we know and some of which we probably don't know, or it could be an obstruction problem, like you said, like a stone getting caught in that duct, and it blocks those digestive enzymes from getting out into the gut. So instead they're digesting the pancreas instead of digesting the food.
Wow. So, Melena, I think you might be too modest to acknowledge this, but Greg, I'm going to ask you to chime in. So how unique is this work that the two of you are doing? And where does the U of M kind of come into this in terms of just, this work, frankly, in the world?
Well, this mad scientist in 1977 was interested in curing diabetes. And he was very frustrated with the fact that when he was doing islet harvesting in animals and then putting them into other animals, the islets would die. So he said, well, I know of this population of patients that's suffering, and we could maybe do the same thing in patients and give their own islets back and figure out why the islets are dying in animals. So David Sutherland came up with this idea in people, and did this in the first patient in 1977 with chronic pancreatitis. Her islets then functioned for the rest of her life. And he figured out that it was the immunosuppressive regimen that was causing the death of the islets in his animals. What's interesting about that is David was trying to solve the problem of diabetes. Islet allo transplant, giving somebody else's islets to another person to cure diabetes, is still very experimental, while what we now do on a weekly basis at the University of Minnesota is fairly standardized now, and at least is becoming more common for this unusual disease. So I'm very proud of our efforts at the University of Minnesota. David Sutherland, my senior colleague, invented this operation and really helped start our program here at the University of Minnesota.
That's great. So Chris, before we turn to, I think we're getting closer, it'd be fun to sort of have you share some of your artistic interpretations of some of the things that happened in your, this voluminous, 161 page book that you put together of all of this. There is, you've got so many interesting photographs and portrayals of things in there. There is one place where you have a little ledger where it's like all the things that were taken out of you. And Greg, because you're a fixer, you're a surgeon, you take things out of people. You sometimes put, you stitch things up, of course, but like how, in this case, in a total pancreatectomy, removing the pancreas, there were some other things that came out with that. And tell us the things you took out of Chris and kind of the rationale for that. Like, why is all of that necessary to do that?
Well, the pancreas comes out because that's the organ that's causing the pain in Chris and people like Chris. The pancreas shares a close blood supply and relationship with two other organs, the duodenum, which wraps around the head of the pancreas, and the spleen, which is out at the tail of the pancreas. Over decades of struggling with how to safely remove the pancreas, we have figured out as surgeons that to do this safely, if you're going to remove the whole pancreas, you have to remove the duodenum and the spleen at the same time. If you still have your gallbladder and you're having this operation, because you disturb the drainage of the bile duct, those patients, if you leave the gallbladder behind, have a 100% chance of developing gallstones that causes them major problems down the road. And so the gallbladder comes out at the same time. Finally, because I'm in there for 10 hours doing this operation, if you have your appendix left, it's a 3-minute operation to remove the appendix. And so I throw that in as a plus, because no surgeon is ever going to want to go back in there to take out somebody's appendix after we've done a total pancreatectomy, islet auto transplant, splenectomy, cholecystectomy, and Roux-en-Y, duodenojejunectomy, and choledocojejunectomy. So we take out the appendix, so that never gives people problems again.
So for all the people listening, one of the reasons we go to medical school is we spend the entire first year of medical school learning to speak the language of medicine. I really mean this. It's like we are going to like foreign language camp, and we all understand. It's like this whole separate side language that we speak and understand. The duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, comes off the stomach, and then is the first part of the whole intestine. And the good thing is, Greg, thank goodness, right? We don't need a gallbladder to live. We don't need a spleen to live. We can kind of get around part of the intestines. Now with this amazing process that the two of you work on, we can put some islet cells in the liver and get them to sort of find a new home and have a conversation, which I don't know if I've ever thought of it as a conversation before, Melena. Thank you for that.
It might be a one direction conversation. I'm not sure the liver speaks back. I guess it sends the blood vessels, but
they're a little bossy, right?
Islets definitely send out some chemical signals to talk.
Yeah. That's awesome. So Chris, holy cow, I feel like we've had this like virtual surgical experience inside your abdomen. I've looked through your book. I've seen your organs. So here we are. I mean, you're an artist. You're a human being. You're a resilient human being. You've got great reasons to keep fighting this struggle. You found people that listen to you, that could do things to save your life, quite literally. And you're processing all of this, and you're looking at things, and you're looking at paper cups, you're looking at ceiling tile, you're looking at the curtains. So tell us more about, what you're thinking, what you're observing as an artist as well as a human being, and maybe how you've interpreted some of that into this phenomenal kind of virtual exhibition that you've been putting together.
Yeah, so interesting enough, I didn't really start making this project, or at least like working on it in a real way until at least 2 years after my surgery. And I think that like the recovery from the surgery, and I think Dr. Beilman and Dr. Bellin warned me about this, it's a steep hill. Like that recovery was intense. And so turning the corner from fighting for an answer to recovering from a surgery is a really interesting switch point. And so for me, at least, in the beginning, I was collecting out of necessity, right? So like, I end up with 920 pages of medical records, and I have, 600 pages of ledgers of all of the bills that I've had to sort of cipher through. And so those are the things that sort of you keep through, you keep track of the medicines. And so like the weight of all of these, both physically and also mentally and emotionally, it was so heavy that I didn't know what else to do with it except for hold on to it and begin to sort of think about it more like a collection. And so like, along the way, I think I started finding some interesting elements throughout. So like this is ledgers and bills from, this is only one page of the contact sheets, but it's interesting enough to see like the human touch. I started asking some questions. So like someone goes through and highlights the amounts, but then also does kind of a squiggle that's in there. And so I started getting interested in where the humans show up in this big system, because I am sort of receiving this, and it's not like a big machine that does this. These are actually, human beings that are actually touching these. And so like, my medical records, I started seeing like them as lines, maybe more so than I was looking at them directly for the data that was on there. And I found those elements to be kind of a way to quantify what I was sort of experiencing. And so, medicine bottles, I have a collection of medicine bottles for about 1 year, which is about 22 pages. And so it's like looking through all of the aesthetic experience of being ill is not just the physicality of these elements or sort of your own experience, but also the visceral components, right? So the sounds that are happening when you're in the hospital, the dings that tell me something when I'm in the room, the scans that are sort of speaking to. These are all things that get inside and are part of the experience. And so again, I collected some of this along the way as a means of documentation. So particularly before I had a diagnosis. And I also spent a lot of time looking at ceiling tiles. I spent a lot of time staring up at ceilings and waiting for tests and sort of the timing of things. And so I would say that in that first bit, in terms of before diagnosis, I maybe was collecting to maybe understand. And in the book, I also share a few self-portraits as well that sort of look through, I was wanting to understand what I looked like from the outside, right? With the big tube coming out of my nose. I didn't know what that looked like because I'd never experienced that before. And then gradually, as I turned a corner towards more thinking about recovery, and this was really around the surgery time, I got the opportunity to watch a surgery of Dr. Beilman's. So I think it was, I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but about the year mark of my surgery, after I kind of made it to the worst part of the recovery, I asked Dr. Beilman, hey, could I come watch a surgery of yours? And he's like, sure, I don't think I've ever had, I've had one other patient ever want to do this before. And so we worked it out, but that was an interesting moment to be able to see exactly the way that Dr. Beilman does his work in the surgery, but really how the team of people in that room is orchestrated. It was it was just a very fascinating experience. And to sort of get that experience was a really great experience. So I started collecting more of these elements and scans. And eventually, it kind of led more to collecting other items that were happening, but I think Dr. Beilman looked at me a little funny when I said, hey, will you make sure to photograph my organs? I'd like to see them. And I think, I don't know if you remember, Dr. Beilman, we had a bit of a conversation about how you should be conscious of the light when you photograph them to make sure there isn't too much reflection, because I wanted to actually see the organ, the part that was diseased. And so I kind of got fascinated and I started asking a lot more questions. Again, that turning point towards recovery was something that I wasn't necessarily thinking that I would make a body of work as much as it was my way of understanding. If I collect the data, if I begin to think about the visuals, if I connect to some of these elements, then I might understand this a little bit better.
Thank you, Chris. Greg, I have to go back for a second. There was almost a throwaway comment, but 10-hour procedure. How does a person do that for 10 hours? I mean, I think the people listening to this conversation would probably be really curious to know, like, how does one physically get through a 10-hour procedure? That is extraordinary and frankly kind of superhuman.
It's what I do, so I don't think about it too much, John. It's your focus is a little square that's 6 or 7 inches in diameter, and it's step 1, step 2, step 3, and problem solving along the way. And so it's very easy to spend time doing this. And then typically it's 4 or 5 hours of fairly intense work up front. And then honestly, at my age, I go take a leak, if you'll excuse the expression, and come back and do the less intense plumbing work, hooking things back up. And then we have a couple hours where we're waiting on the islets to come back from the islet lab. And then another hour or 2 of closing things up. And so it's incredibly gratifying. And going from the average length of time of a general surgery case, which is 1 hour and 15 minutes, to 10 hours is a bit different practice, but something that I've enjoyed doing.
Wow. Chris, you mentioned this when you were watching this, like we should let folks know that at the hospital, there is one operating room, Greg, that has the ability, like the observation, quality to it, which, operating theater there is definitely that element to it. And I think also, and Chris, you were starting to allude to this, that there's a choreography that occurs. And Greg, I mean, it's not ballet, it's not dance per se, but there's a choreography. Everyone knows their role. So we can certainly take a theater kind of metaphor and apply it, that this is, there's a theater element to this. There's a choreography. These are professionals, they know what they're doing. Greg, you're not getting in on your team on a day like that. That's a newbie. I mean, these are seasoned people that know what they're doing and know how to assist you and do this complex surgery, I'm guessing.
And I want to highlight how important it is that it's a team. And it isn't about the surgeon, although there's lots of jokes about how important the surgeon is. It's the whole medical team, and that includes everybody who is doing the operation, the people that are making sure the right instruments are there, the nurses who are helping take care of the patient around the time of surgery, after surgery, during the recovery. We couldn't do this without Louise, Emily, and Marie, our nurses who help with Chris's and others' recovery. It's just a real privilege to work as a team member. And getting back to the way you introduced me, John, it's really been highlighted over this last 2 years, because we've delivered amazing care at the University of Minnesota and across the country to all these people who have COVID, who are dying of their disease, and it would not be possible without that team approach. Yeah. Sorry for my digression, sir.
No, thank you. That's exactly right. I think there is, we all, here we are, we're 1, 2, 3, 4 physicians on this. And if we were to be, more equitable about this, we'd have all kinds of team members. In fact, Chris, you're one of the first people that really kind of shepherded you through this process, was a nurse practitioner. And we couldn't do what we do without our colleagues. And I think that's worth stating that in a very important, emphatic way. Dr. Bellin, this is what you do. You see all kinds of patients like this. Have you ever seen sort of the work you do through the eyes of someone like Chris before? And I'm guessing the answer is no, but I'd like to your thought on that. And then an important question I'll ask you, and then I'll ask Dr. Beilman and Dr. Pingle is now that you've worked with Chris, you've seen this body of work through a completely different set of eyes. Does this change how you perceive what you do a little bit? And I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, well, so to your first question, no. We work with really incredible patients from all types of backgrounds, but this is certainly the first where we've had someone turn this medical process into art. And that is just, it's fascinating. I don't think Chris maybe even got to these in his presentation, but the medications, we saw the islets turned into artwork, but even the number of medications that patients take, right, during the recovery, and to some extent, even after they're recovered, because we have to replace things like, digestive pancreas function, even after someone recovers, but particularly in that early recovery period, Chris turned the bottles of medications into a piece of art. So it's really interesting to see things reflected back that way. I think sometimes we do see that visualization of the journey in various ways from patients who aren't artists, but will bring in their own sort of diagrams or pictures or ways that they have represented their journey to get to us. So that component, I think we've seen in other ways, and it's always interesting to see those journeys, because you see that one diagram that shows everything for many years is quite fascinating.
Thank you. Greg, you have seen so much. I think as a trauma surgeon, you have been in war zones, literally. You do the quick surgeries like mine, my hernia repair, which is somewhere on the low scale of complexity, although certain people have waited too long to get their hernias repaired, as I recall. And then you got this 10-hour process. But has Chris's work caused you to sort of look at this work that you almost take for granted in a different way?
Absolutely. And, it's really been gratifying for me to look at this from the perspective of the patient. And, Chris alluded to the fact that Melena and I and our team actually warns everybody about that 1 year recovery, the struggles that they'll have in typically coming off of the pain medicine and some of the other issues. But it's really fun to see, looking at what we do through different eyes and from a completely different perspective.
Yeah. Thank you. And Dr. Pingle, Janine, as my colleague here at the Mill City Clinic, we have a lot of artist patients of one kind or another. But it strikes me that this particular, not to refer you as a case, Chris, but Chris's case is pretty extraordinary. And has your work with Chris affected you in a different way, or do you look at this process a little bit differently as a result?
I can't do anything but change my world. This changed my world. I mean, you're right. We do see a lot of patients that have artistic backgrounds, et cetera, but Chris really transformed his experience into an art that was something I'd never seen done. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I think that, each time I have even, somebody the other day was talking kind of studying their gown as they were wearing it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, I appreciated so much just that moment that was made me smile. Those are the moments that I think, this could be, this could be something. And it's just a moment, but it's like, Chris, you took this to the epitome, and you made such an interesting thing out of such a difficult journey that you were on. You took the ordinary and you made it extraordinary. And I really do mean that. And I don't think we'll ever quite look at our individual things that we that we use every day. I think that you brought real joy to that. So that's how I feel.
Thank you. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you a question in just a moment, but I'd like to take this opportunity, as I think we've had our own journey here with this conversation, and I have a feeling that there are people listening to us who've perhaps had a similar experience themselves, or know one that's had a similar experience. And I'd love to see some queries come in the Q&A section. There is one, Chris, and I'll just go to that right now, that if you could share a little bit more about the book and perhaps how that came about. And I'm guessing people are going to want to see it. And can people see it, or is this just a private thing that you've self-published? Tell us more about it.
Well, the book right now is in the exhibition space. So if you're able to see the pop-up exhibit that's at the Weisman now, there's a copy in there. It's not public yet, but I'm working it out.
Yeah.
I think there's something that it's incredibly personal about sharing this amount of work, sort of particularly this part of the journey. So when it's public, I'll let you know for sure. Yeah.
There is one question about where are you able to share any more of your art as we're talking here? I'm thinking in particular of some of the, I hate to call it wallpaper for lack of a better description, but it kind of is the way you've turned things in. And so for folks as we're waiting to see some of this, I went to the exhibit this afternoon, and if anyone saw me, I'd had my nose almost pressed up against the wall, looking at the intricacy of the patterns and realizing, oh my gosh, it's a catheter. And Chris has turned it into art. And the big pictures you had that were illuminated, were those surgical scars, where the staples were, or where did those come from? I was wondering what those large kind of black objects were.
Well, those are the organs that Dr. Beilman removed from my body. So they're, I can show, let me show you the installation. So here's some of the wallpapers that were made. This was a feeding tube that Dr. Beilman let me keep.
It's not up yet, Chris. If you want to try it again, it's not sharing.
Sorry about that. Let's try.
Oh, no problem.
In here.
Gives us all a chance just to breathe for a second and reflect on your work and your journey. And I would encourage, I'm just going to just do this a little shout out. I was a multi-year member of the Colleagues Advisory Board at the Weisman Art Museum. And it was a really great honor to do that. I had a chance to meet the new director after the entire history of the Weisman Art Museum in its current location. Lyndall King stepped down, and Alejandra Peña from Mexico is now the new director, and she was in Puerto Rico before she came to Minnesota. So here we are. So thanks, Chris.
Yeah. So this is the actual exhibition space. Are these the objects that you were sort of referring to? So the organs, this is my pancreas and duodenum. And so they're actually, these were the photographs of the organs that were removed after Dr. Beilman removed them. He photographed them, and then I used those to create these mandalas. These are the rest of the organs that were removed. And maybe it'd be kind of interesting, Dr. Beilman could describe what organs we're looking at here, because it might be more anatomically correct.
So that's the spleen there that you're circling.
Yeah.
The next one over is a segment of the small bowel that we removed. I am not sure what that is. I think that's gallbladder, head to head.
Yeah.
Or maybe you did two spleens put head to head there. And then on the inside, the kind of the rosette on the inside is small bowel again.
So then these are the custom wallpapers that are made both from the records, but then also various tests that I took. So this was a common thing I always had close by, was a barf bag. And so I started using that as kind of a framing or shape that reoccurs in the work. And then here is x-rays from my bowels as well. So everything that's in this actual show is taken from medical imagery and or experiences that were connected.
Chris, I have to ask you, so as I looked closely at it, one of the patterns was eggs and toast, and I need to know the significance of eggs and toast.
So those are some nice radioactive eggs that you get to eat for a stomach emptying test. And there's a nice big radioactive sign at the door when you walk in, and you sort of eat these things. And yeah.
Are you able to eat eggs, scrambled eggs to this day, or is it just like you can't even look at them?
Not my favorite.
Yeah.
Not my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's the chemical drug structure that's on the floor that kind of is almost like the rug that's in that space?
Yeah, so that structure is actually morphine. And I was interested in this idea, like Dr. Beilman had mentioned, so much of this disease has to do with pain and the relationship to pain and pain medication, that it had to have a presence in this illness. At least it did for anyone that I know that has gone through it. And so that was a component along with some pill bottles that are also made of the pattern beneath it.
And Chris, so much of the pattern, someone commented in the Q&A about almost like a kaleidoscopic kind of look. I mean, it looks like you're looking through a kaleidoscope. Was that something you had in mind as you're putting some of these together?
Yeah, I mean, this was a very site-specific piece of work, because in the Weisman, you have this really amazing opportunity to play with the planes. So when you're looking up the side of the wall, it's really intense to sort of look up at the angles that Frank Gehry designed, right? And so I wanted to sort of play with the patterns to sort of disrupt the viewer as they're in the space, and sort of maybe even a bit nauseating to some degree. So it's I maybe recommend some breaks from time to time.
Yeah. Well, this is just utterly fascinating, and I have to say, I've never ever seen anything like this. I'm thinking, Chris, were there any inspirations that you had as artists? I mean, Henri Matisse famously was bedridden when he did his jazz series, right? He did the cutouts, and he was recuperating from an illness at that time. But are there other artists that have inspired you along this way?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I think I'm always looking and trying to understand visual culture around us. I think that in this case, I was trying my hardest to respond to the shapes and sort of the actual components of what I was looking at, and that those dictated sort of the patterns and the color palettes. And I have a very logical approach to making work. So like for me, it was all connected back to sampling colors from my own organs to put back into this. But most definitely, like, wallpaper design has a long history, and also pattern design has a long history of making sense in the world, and trying to understand both who we are as humans and the marks that we make in repetition.
Let me do this. I mean, we certainly have some time left. I want to be, I'll be watching the Q&A, but as we're, kind of wrapping things up a little bit, Dr. Bellin, so we've kind of, I mean, is it fair to say that we've perfected this technique? I mean, is this something that is pretty standard now? And obviously you've been a big part of that. And if yes, or if no, what's next for you? Like, what are you working on right now, kind of in this area?
Yeah, so we have an amazing technical team, the other part of our team, the islet isolation team, who does this work. And they have become very, very good over the years at getting islets even out of a very scarred, damaged pancreas, and actually have learned techniques to adapt that islet isolation process actually to each individual pancreas, adjusting for some things like scar tissue that we know affects how well those islets are released. So in many ways, we're very technically proficient, but there is a lot of room for improvement in outcomes, I think, on the islet transplant side. And not because our team members aren't amazing, but because there are some challenges, like the fact that even though the disease is in the digestive pancreas, a lot of times the scarring has damaged the islets by the time people get to surgery. And when we do this transplant process, even though that crosstalk between the liver and the islets is really good, there's some inflammation and other things that damage the islets along the way. So things we are working on is really how to optimize that transplant process to get as many of those cells to survive as possible. Some people will stay on insulin. In fact, many people will stay on a little bit of insulin after this procedure. And we'd like to be able to get more people completely off insulin because that's just, healthier and better quality of life, generally speaking, to be able to get rid of that medication insulin and not have to worry about that. So there are places where we're still trying to do this even better so that the post-surgery side is even better.
That's great. Thank you. Greg, so 10-hour procedure, you've got this little window in which you're working on all these different pieces and taking things out and reassembling things. Has the surgical, has like the advancements in surgery led to, it's about as perfected as it's going to be, or are there still things that can be done better or more easily?
So John, there's always things that can be done better.
I'm setting you up for that.
Yeah. The areas of interest now are, can you do this with a surgical robot or through a laparoscopic incision? Right now, the data is not strong to suggest that the outcomes are any different or any better that way. I think, honestly, the long-term solution is going to be something other than me or another surgeon having to take out the pancreas and coming up with another way to treat the pain of pancreatitis without having to do this big operation with a 1-year recovery. Yeah. I'd like to think that's going to happen in the next 10 years, and we'll see.
Is it possible that is there any role for stem cells in this kind of work, like trying to get the pancreas to heal itself in a way? Is that being looked at?
I think more right now, and Melena probably has to say more about it than I can. So why don't you talk about it, Melena?
Yeah, so not so much in the repair of the pancreas, but in the replacement of the islets. And this is more happening right now in the type 1 diabetes world, but I think eventually would be very applicable to patients like Chris who have their pancreas out. That there are scientists and pharmaceutical companies now that have been able to develop some functional islet cells from stem cells. and are in initial phases of clinical trials with people with type 1 diabetes to try to give those, created islet cells back to people with diabetes to try to get people off insulin and restore that function of the pancreas. So in terms of where stem cells might fit for people having this procedure, this pancreatectomy procedure, it may be, well, if we can't get enough islet cells or those islet cells stop working, maybe we can use these manufactured islet cells from stem cells to give that function back.
Awesome. Thank you. So Janine, Dr. Pingle, here's Chris. He's on the other side of this. I feel like the whole journey, it's kind of, there's a lot of circles here, and he's back here in primary care, I'm imagining, doing some of the routine kind of things. Do you look at patients like Chris in a different way? I mean, is there anything that you're, you've been down such a complicated, deep, painful path, and you've been there with him along his recovery. Do you look at people like Chris differently, or treat them differently as a primary care physician after a journey like that?
Well, I think that truly when you're a primary care physician, you have to be ready for things like this. But, it's our job to sort of be there, like, as the backdrop for our patients. And as I always told Chris, I know you're seeing specialists, but I'm still your doctor. So I really, we did this, like, through this journey, we were seeing each other so much. We were troubleshooting, working hard, if nothing else, just to hear, how are you doing this week? Tell me what's happened. I think there was some benefit in even just having those touch points, even if I didn't have exactly the answer or I couldn't make things better that day. And after the fact that now that you've gone through this whole process, Chris, that you are still my patient, it shapes you as a person. It shaped me to go through that experience with you. And that brings a light for me to be a good ear to other patients. But that's really what it is. It's not just taking care of that single patient. You are part of a family, part of a profession. You are, you're a dad. And I heard all those facets about you. And that really brings to light the fact that in primary care, we are so privileged to have those patients share their story with us, be part of their story, and continue to take care of them for the next steps, and hopefully good steps. But we'll be ready for whatever, right?
That's great. Thank you, Janine. So Chris, there is a question here, a philosophical question from a fellow artist, Nate Stromberg. And Nate, thanks for joining us. I actually recognize this name. And he writes, this work is deeply personal and references trauma. Presenting it requires being really vulnerable and open. Is art making a kind of therapy and recovery for you, or is it another way to make sense of your experience?
Nice question, Nate.
I figured you might know Nate.
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I don't know. To be honest, I think I had not made work in this way before, and it's new to me. And to be honest, it was like really hard for me to share this work. I struggled with it because it diverges from previous work that I've made that's more institutional critique. And so there's this real hard balance as a visual artist of what becomes therapeutic and you put out in the world for that. For me, it had to be this note I wrote down here that this project is really for doctors and patients. I made it for that purpose so that there's some thread to follow through and to tell this story, and to, I'm number 648th person to have this surgery. There are a lot of people who have come before me. There's actually a lot of people that are living suffering at this moment that don't have as good of results. And so I think about them also, like sort of speaking up and sort of giving opportunity. So yes, Nate, I think it can be very therapeutic. I'm working through it.
And I think this is an important question too. And this is just more of a truly humanistic question, Chris. How are you doing now?
Yeah, thanks for, I'm doing good. I mean, my life is there's a different normal than there was prior to my illness, most definitely. So I've got some complications that I have to consider. But I am pain-free, and I can exercise, and I can carry my kids, and I can do, well, barely because they're getting old, but like I can do all the sort of things that you would expect to do, and I'm back to work and those types of things. So for me, that joy outweighs some of the new normals.
That's great. Well, thank you. I think that this is a really great place to maybe stop our conversation. We've had just wonderful comments pouring in. Dr. Beilman, thank you for answering some of the ones that I cannot answer. So talk about teamwork and choreography happening here seamlessly. It's been great. And Dr. Bellin, Dr. Beilman, Dr. Pingle, thank you. What an incredible set of colleagues I have. I think that we as Minnesotans should be so proud of the work that's being done at this institution, at other institutions, of course. I know there was at least one colleague on this call from Mayo, and great work is being done all over the place. But I'm just incredibly proud of my colleagues on this call. Makes me proud to be part of the university, part of the medical school, part of this healing community. It's important again to mention that none of us could do what we do without our teams. Everyone from people answering the phone call to running the clinics, to rooming our patients, to working with us, doing the triage work, the care coordinators. I mean, it just isn't possible without this incredible team. And Chris, I don't know what to say. I think that I love the arts. I've been immersed in the arts. I've never seen anything like the body of work that you put together, and it is absolutely extraordinary. You have changed the way I look at the world, and certainly look at the human body, at medications, at pieces of equipment. I'm not going to be looking at things the same way ever again, and I think a lot of people feel the same way. So thank you for being vulnerable, for sharing this, for sharing your process. I think you really have changed the way that we view things. And this is coming from a bunch of physicians who've been doing this for a number of years here. So thank you. And I know that Boris wanted to come back and have a few closing words on behalf of the Weisman Art Museum.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, John, for emceeing this wonderful conversation. And thank you, Chris, for being so generous and vulnerable with your experiences. Please come see Chris's exhibition at the Weisman. It's up until Sunday. And Chris will also be there, remind me, on Saturday, right?
Correct, 2 to 5, I'll be there.
Come talk to Chris on Saturday, 2 to 5. Please consider responding to our surveys that we will send you after this event. They help us make better programs in the future. And good night.